Hello my dear friends, welcome to Hauntra. Make sure to hit the subscribe button and press the bell icon so that you don't miss any exciting coming up videos. It was a crisp autumn evening when Ben, a weary road tripper, decided to veer off the main highway in search of a shortcut to his destination. He had been on the road for hours, the monotonous hum of his car barely keeping him awake. As he glanced at his GPS, a strange route popped up that wasn't listed on any map he had, nor was it part of the well-trodden roads around him. Curiosity got the better of him. He decided to follow the faint path that had only one sign, Vanishing Highway. With a hesitant breath, Ben turned onto the desolate road, the trees on either side whispering with the wind. As he drove further, he noticed the eerie silence. No other vehicles, no houses, just endless trees and empty space. The road felt strangely isolated, and an unsettling pressure hung in the air, making his skin crawl. The GPS seemed to be malfunctioning, showing him in the middle of nowhere. His headlights barely penetrated the thick fog that had begun to creep up around his car. The road seemed to narrow the further he went, as though the highway itself was closing in on him. Ben tried to shake off the feeling of dread, but deep down, he couldn't ignore the pull of something unnatural. As Ben continued down the winding path, the road seemed to twist and turn in unnatural ways, leading him deeper into the woods. The dense fog now engulfed his car, making it impossible to see beyond a few feet in any direction. He could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on him, the isolation growing more oppressive with each passing minute. His headlights flickered once, then twice, casting fleeting shadows across the road ahead. Then, without warning, the road split into two. A small sign marked the fork in the road. No words, just a faded, chipped arrow pointing to the left. Ben hesitated for a moment. His GPS was completely blank, as if the system had just given up. A nervous chuckle escaped his lips, but it did little to quell the unease gnawing at him. He chose the left path, hoping it would lead to something familiar, even though every part of him screamed to turn back. The road now became even narrower, the trees pressing closer on either side, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. As Ben drove on, the car's engine began to sputter, and the faint smell of burning oil reached his nose. He cursed under his breath, knowing he didn't have much fuel left. Then, as he looked in the rearview mirror, he saw something that made his heart race. Another set of headlights, dim and distant, following him. The sound of the approaching vehicle grew louder, its engine a low hum behind him. Ben's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He glanced nervously in his rearview mirror, but the headlights were still too far away to make out the car. It didn't seem to be speeding up, but it was definitely gaining on him, despite the fact that Ben's own car was moving at a steady pace. His heart began to pound as the distance between them closed. Yet when he glanced out his side window, there was no sign of the vehicle beside him. The fog thickened, almost as if it were moving with intention, swallowing up the road ahead. Ben's mind raced. Who else would be out here at this hour? His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden flicker of light in his rearview mirror, followed by a low, guttural sound from his car's engine. The car jerked violently, and Ben fought to keep control of the wheel as the headlights behind him now grew blindingly bright. A shadow moved swiftly across the road, momentarily blocking his view. Panic surged through Ben's veins. He pressed down on the accelerator, trying to outrun whatever was chasing him, but the car sputtered again, barely responding. The headlights grew closer. Ben could feel a cold sweat drenching his back. He had to find a way out of this nightmare. Ben's car finally came to a halt, sputtering as it lost power entirely. The headlights went dark. For a moment, everything was silent, except for the unsettling sound of wind rustling through the trees. Ben's breath came in short, panicked gasps as he sat frozen in his seat. The strange headlights behind him had vanished, and the fog was so thick that he could barely make out the outline of his own car. Then, a soft tapping on the window broke the stillness. Ben jumped, his heart pounding in his chest. Slowly, he turned to face the window, only to find a man standing outside, his face obscured by the fog. The man's clothes looked old-fashioned, almost like something from the past. Faded jeans and a long, tattered jacket. His expression was unreadable, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of a worn-out cap. The stranger tapped the window again, a slow, deliberate motion. Ben's pulse quickened. What was this man doing out here, alone, in the middle of nowhere? He hesitated but rolled down the window slightly, enough to hear the man's voice. "Lost, aren't you?" The stranger whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. Ben's hand trembled as he gripped the steering wheel. He had no choice but to follow the stranger's unsettling advice. The man had told him there was a shortcut up ahead, and though everything in his instincts screamed not to trust him, Ben reluctantly followed. The road stretched out before him, but it looked completely unfamiliar, like something had shifted in the landscape. His GPS was still out of service, and he felt an odd sense of unease settle deeper into his chest. As the miles passed, Ben noticed something even stranger. No matter how far he drove, the trees lining the road never seemed to change. They all looked identical, as though they were part of some vast, looping forest with no beginning and no end. He began to wonder if he was somehow driving in circles. The thought made his stomach tighten. His car, which had been acting up earlier, now seemed to move more smoothly, as though it had a mind of its own. Suddenly, he noticed a faint glow on the horizon. A large sign appeared out of the fog. "End of the road," it read. But there was no exit, no visible road beyond it. Ben slammed on the brakes, his heart racing. He had nowhere to go. Ben's mind raced as he stared at the end of the road sign. The fog was growing heavier, suffocating the space around him, and the eerie glow from the sign seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. He tried to reverse, but the car stalled again, as if something was preventing him from leaving. His heartbeat quickened, and he turned around, looking for any sign of life, any indication that this nightmare could end. In the distance, the faint hum of an engine reached his ears. Ben's eyes snapped to the rearview mirror. The headlights appeared again, glowing bright through the dense fog. This time, however, the car wasn't behind him. It was directly beside him, in the exact same position as his own. His hands gripped the steering wheel, paralyzed with fear. The car's headlights reflected off the fog, but when Ben looked to the side, no vehicle was there. Suddenly, a voice crackled through the car speakers, low and distorted. "Turn back," it warned. "This road, it's not meant for you." The words echoed in his mind, and the temperature inside the car plummeted, his breath now visible in the cold air. He turned to face the front again, but the road ahead was gone. The fog had swallowed it entirely. There was nothing left but an empty, endless void. Ben's eyes darted across the fog-choked space, desperate for an answer. But all he saw was an impenetrable wall of white. His breath came in shallow gasps, and his hands trembled uncontrollably as he fumbled for the door handle. The chilling silence around him was broken only by the low hum of the engine, still running despite the car having no clear path forward. Then, out of nowhere, a whisper echoed from the back seat. "You shouldn't have come," it hissed, a voice so cold and distant that it sent a shiver through Ben's entire body. His head snapped around, but no one was there. He could feel his skin crawling as the voice grew louder, more urgent. "Turn around, or you'll never leave." Frozen in terror, Ben tried to start the car again, but the engine sputtered in response. The voice had become a deafening scream. "Turn back now." His hands were shaking so badly that he couldn't even feel the steering wheel under his grip. The fog outside grew even thicker, completely enveloping the car, as if it were trapping him in place. Without warning, the car jolted forward, as though something invisible had forced it into motion. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, and Ben felt as though he were being pulled toward something dark and unforgiving. Ben's car lurched forward through the dense fog, the headlights now struggling to cut through the mist. His mind raced, desperate for an explanation, any explanation of what was happening. Was this some kind of strange dream? No, it felt far too real. The low hum of the engine was the only sound he could focus on. But then, out of the corner of his eye, something caught his attention. A figure emerged from the fog, walking at an unsettling pace. It was the stranger from earlier. Ben's heart skipped a beat. He recognized the face, but it didn't make sense. How could he be here? The man's movements were slow, almost deliberate, as he walked alongside the car, never looking at Ben. Ben tried to roll down the window, but his hands were frozen to the wheel. The stranger's voice pierced the air like a razor-sharp blade. "You'll never leave this place, just like the others." His words sent a deep chill down Ben's spine. With a sudden, jerky motion, the stranger's face twisted into a grotesque grin. "This road, it claims all who venture upon it." Before Ben could respond, the figure vanished, as though he had never been there at all. Ben's breathing grew shallow as the figure disappeared into the mist. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that this wasn't just a strange road. This was something far worse. As the car continued to inch forward, the road began to twist, distorting in ways that didn't make sense. The trees that once lined the highway now appeared to be moving, their shapes bending and stretching in unnatural ways. Desperately, Ben turned to check the rearview mirror again, hoping to catch a glimpse of anything familiar. Instead, all he saw was the same endless fog. The strange headlights had vanished, and the road behind him was completely gone, replaced by an endless abyss of white. His panic reached new heights. "Where am I?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The fog felt suffocating, pressing in from all sides. He tried to stop the car, but the brakes wouldn't respond. It was as if the car itself was determined to keep moving. Suddenly, the road ahead shifted again, opening into a wide, dark stretch. In the distance, Ben could make out something large and looming, like a building, or perhaps a monument. It was impossible to tell, but the sight of it stirred a deep sense of dread within him. He had no choice but to drive toward it, hoping it would lead him to an escape. As Ben's car inched closer to the dark figure in the distance, he felt a coldness seep through his veins. His hands were sweating, his mouth dry. The fog grew thicker, and the figure began to take shape. It was no building, no monument. What loomed ahead was a massive, twisted structure, made entirely of trees, their trunks intertwined and knotted, forming an enormous, gnarled sculpture that reached high into the sky. It resembled a grotesque tree, but the branches seemed to stretch like skeletal fingers. The car slowed as Ben approached it, drawn toward the unnatural sight, unable to stop himself. He could feel a strange compulsion taking over, as though something was beckoning him closer. His fingers trembled on the steering wheel, and for a brief moment he thought he saw faces in the bark of the tree, etched into the twisted wood. He blinked, and they were gone. But the feeling of being watched, of being surrounded by something malevolent, grew stronger. The air itself seemed to hum with an ancient energy. Ben had come to a realization. This wasn't just a road. This was a place where the lost were claimed, and once you entered, you could never leave. Ben couldn't shake the feeling that the tree was watching him, its twisted branches like arms reaching toward him. The closer he got, the more the air thickened, a heavy sense of dread closing in on him. His heart raced as he stared at the dark figure ahead. The fog had now taken on an almost tangible form, swirling around his car like a living, breathing entity. The low hum of the engine was the only sound, yet it felt distant, as though coming from another world. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the fog. Ben slammed his foot on the brake, heart skipping a beat. Something had moved. No, someone. In the fog ahead, the silhouette of a person appeared in front of the twisted tree, standing motionless. Ben's eyes widened in disbelief. It was the same stranger from before, his face now ghastly pale and eyes hollow, staring directly at Ben. The man slowly raised his hand, pointing toward the tree. Ben's breath caught in his throat as the ground beneath his car began to tremble. A low, guttural growl reverberated through the air, filling the space around him. The fog parted momentarily, revealing a strange, massive shape behind the tree. Something monstrous, covered in shadows. It moved, but its form was too distorted to make out. Ben could feel his hands shaking uncontrollably. He had to get out of there. Ben's mind raced as the figure in front of him stood unmoving, its hollow eyes fixed on him with an intensity that sent a wave of terror through his body. The car trembled slightly as the growling noise continued, its source still hidden in the dense fog. He felt like he was being pulled toward the stranger, as if something invisible was forcing him to draw nearer. The stranger's outstretched hand trembled, still pointing toward the tree. The strange hum of the fog seemed to reverberate with a deeper, almost inhuman tone. Ben's thoughts scrambled. His hands shook as he grabbed the gear shift and attempted to move, but the car was frozen in place. No matter how hard he pressed the accelerator, the car wouldn't budge. The fog closed in further, wrapping the car like a suffocating blanket. The figure's eyes never left him, cold and unblinking. Then, without warning, the ground beneath the car cracked, a deep, jagged fissure spreading across the road. The fog parted briefly to reveal the dark shape that had been lurking behind the tree, its form massive, almost too large to comprehend. It was moving toward him now, its presence overwhelming. The stranger's grin widened, and Ben knew he was trapped. He reached for the door handle, but before he could react, a shrill screech filled the air. The air around Ben grew thick with dread, his heart pounding as the growling sound intensified. The ground beneath him groaned, and the car's body quivered as if the road itself was alive. Ben could feel the intense pull of the shadow as it inched closer, its form growing clearer with every passing second. The stranger's grin grew impossibly wide, his hollow eyes now glowing with an unnatural light. Ben's breath quickened, the car shaking violently as if fighting against the invisible forces pulling it. The dark figure, a massive silhouette, loomed ever closer. It was something not of this world, its limbs long and twisted, its shape jagged and contorted. The fog around it seemed to move with purpose, parting to reveal its grotesque form more clearly. As the figure stepped forward, the ground beneath Ben's car cracked further, sending a deep tremor through the vehicle. Ben's instincts screamed at him to run, to escape, but he was trapped. The car refused to move, and no matter how much he tried, the door wouldn't open. The figure's eyes locked onto his, and for the briefest moment, Ben felt a strange sense of understanding. A realization that this was no mere creature, but something ancient, something that thrived on fear. Suddenly, the tree behind the figure began to creak, and its branches seemed to reach for Ben's car, the sharp tips of the branches resembling claws. Ben's hands were shaking uncontrollably now, sweat drenching his brow. The grip of fear had taken hold of him completely. The massive figure had now closed the distance between them, towering above the car, its form stretching into the fog. The shadow seemed to press against the car, pushing in on all sides as if trying to squeeze the life out of him. The tree behind the figure creaked again, and Ben's eyes widened as he saw something even more horrifying. The branches had begun to move of their own accord, crawling like serpents, reaching toward the car. The fog seemed to thicken around the vehicle, seeping inside through the cracks in the windows, filling the air with a chilling, suffocating mist. Ben's breath came out in ragged gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. The stranger's face was now impossibly close to his window, his eyes wide and unblinking, filled with a madness Ben couldn't comprehend. The air grew colder, and the low growl of the figure seemed to reverberate through his entire body. With a desperate scream, Ben grabbed for the car door once again, this time using all his strength to open it. But just as his hand touched the handle, the shadow's massive form loomed over him. A cold hand, made of mist and darkness, reached down, grabbing him by the arm and pulling him from the car. Ben was dragged from the car by an invisible force, his body pulled toward the figure, his feet unable to find solid ground. His mind screamed for escape, but it was useless. The shadow's grip tightened, the air around him growing colder with every passing second. He was no longer on solid ground. He was floating, weightless, suspended in an endless sea of darkness. The fog was gone now, replaced by an oppressive black void. Ben couldn't see anything, but he could feel the presence of the creature all around him, its malevolent energy filling the air. He could hear whispers now, faint and distorted, as if the very space around him was alive, breathing with an ancient, insidious force. His body felt as though it were being pulled apart, each second stretching longer than the last. The figure's shadowy form was still there, looming just beyond his reach. Its glowing eyes pierced the darkness, watching him with a hunger that Ben couldn't fathom. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. Panic overtook him as he realized he was being pulled into the very heart of the darkness, into the creature's domain. And then, as if the void had a mind of its own, the whispers grew louder, filling his head with their maddening voices. "You are one of us now," they hissed, "and you will never leave." Ben's world had become a nightmare of darkness and suffocating whispers. The voices in his mind blurred together, no longer distinguishable from one another, but all echoing the same chilling message. "You are ours now." His body floated through the void, unable to move, unable to escape. Every breath he took seemed to draw him deeper into the darkness. The shadowy figure loomed closer, its form becoming clearer with each passing moment. In the distance, Ben saw a faint light. Desperation surged through him. It was the smallest glimmer of hope, and it beckoned him. He tried to move toward it, but the darkness fought against him, wrapping around his limbs like a suffocating coil. The cold hand of the shadow reached out, grabbing his wrist and dragging him back, pulling him away from the light. His heart raced in panic. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if the shadows themselves were pushing him toward the inevitable. He could feel the pull of the shadow's presence, its cold grip tightening around his chest. "Stay with us forever," it seemed to whisper, "and you will never have to fear again." But Ben knew he couldn't give in. He had to fight. Summoning every ounce of strength left in him, he broke free from the shadow's grasp and hurled himself toward the light, the whispers fading into nothingness as he surged forward. As Ben neared the light, the darkness around him seemed to recoil, almost as if it were afraid. The more he fought, the more the oppressive weight of the shadow lifted. But just as he reached the light, a violent, unseen force slammed into him, sending him crashing backward into the void. The force was overwhelming, far stronger than anything Ben had ever felt, and it ripped through him like a physical blow. He gasped for air, his body jerking violently as if it were being torn apart. The light flickered, fading away as the darkness surged back in with a terrifying speed. Ben's heart raced with the fear of being swallowed whole by this endless abyss. He reached out in desperation, hoping for something, anything, to pull him back from the brink. And then, with a sickening snap, the darkness tightened its grip around him again, and the whispers resumed, now louder and more insistent. "You can't escape," they hissed. "You belong to us." Ben's mind spun, but his body refused to obey. His strength was running out, and he was sinking deeper into the void. The light was gone now, and all that remained was the cold, suffocating darkness. He was alone, trapped in a world where nothing made sense, only the shadow, only the whispers. The whispers began to change, their tone now laced with mocking pity. "You should have stayed," they taunted. "Now you'll never leave. There is no escape." Ben's mind raced as he struggled against the crushing darkness. His body was numb, his senses dulled by the weight of despair pressing in on him. He was lost in this endless void, and every moment seemed to stretch on for eternity. But then, something shifted. A strange clarity washed over him, as though the very fabric of the darkness was beginning to unravel. The figure, its form more solid than ever, stood before him once again, its glowing eyes staring down at him with a look of pity mixed with malice. "You could have had peace," the figure whispered, "but now you will suffer forever." It reached out, its shadowy hand extended toward him, and yet something inside Ben snapped. He wasn't ready to give up. He was stronger than this. He had to be. The darkness laughed, a hollow, empty sound that echoed around him. "You can try," the figure said, "but you will never win." Ben clenched his fists, determined. He wasn't ready to surrender to this thing, not now, not ever. The struggle intensified, and Ben's body screamed in protest as the darkness continued to suffocate him. But now, the whispers sounded less like threats and more like desperate pleas. "You can't win. There's no way out. Stay with us." The voice of the shadow seemed to grow weaker, as if it too was being affected by Ben's defiance. The figure in front of him flickered, its edges blurring and distorting, as if it was beginning to fade away. Ben's pulse quickened. This was his chance. With a final defiant roar, he forced his body forward, determined to break through the darkness. His hands shot out, clawing at the void, desperate to feel something solid. And then, he felt it. A slight resistance, a pull on his body. The very fabric of the void was unraveling in response to his will. The figure let out a growl of frustration, but it was too late. Ben had broken free, and with one final push, he tore through the darkness, feeling the oppressive grip of the shadow weaken with every passing moment. The void around him began to fragment, collapsing in on itself. The last remnants of the shadow were dissipating, leaving Ben to fall through the collapsing abyss. Ben's eyes snapped open, gasping for air. He was lying in the middle of a familiar road, the fog completely gone, replaced by the warm light of the morning sun. His body ached, his mind scrambled to make sense of what had just happened. Was it a dream? A nightmare? Or something far worse? He sat up, looking around. The world seemed normal, too normal. But there was a lingering feeling of unease in the pit of his stomach, a sensation that something had followed him back. His eyes darted toward the distance, where the twisted tree still stood, now empty of its strange, dark presence. Ben stood up, brushing the dirt from his clothes. He began to walk toward his car, his steps slow and cautious. His heart was still racing, the remnants of fear pulsing through him. As he approached the car, a cold chill ran down his spine, and the unmistakable sound of a soft whisper reached his ears. "You can never leave us," it whispered, barely audible. Ben froze, his breath catching in his throat. He turned around, but there was nothing there. The tree was empty. He was alone. But deep down he knew the truth. The shadow hadn't gone. It was still with him, and it would follow him forever. Thanks for watching, and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe our channel for more new videos.